Welcome everyone to this session that forms part of Renew's Green Rebuild Toolkit Beyond BAL project. My name is Dr. Rachel Goldlust and I am the Sustainability Researcher at Renew. To begin our session, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the respective lands on which we meet today and pay my respects to their elders past and present. We honour Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's unique cultural and spiritual relationships to the land and sea and acknowledge their sovereignty was never ceded. I also recognise that we have people tuned in from all over the country, from a wide variety of traditional lands. I'm speaking from the Wurundjeri lands, and I encourage you to share where you are joining in from in the chat. So tonight's session focuses on earth-coupled bushfire resilient design and is the third in our Beyond BAL series, which is running each Monday for 4 weeks. Our final session next week will focus on vegetation risks. The Beyond BAL project has been generously funded by grants from Global Giving and the federal government's Black Summer Bushfire Recovery Grants program. Over the webinar series, we are featuring 12 case studies developed as part of our ongoing work to support communities rebuilding after bushfire. The homes in our case studies have resilient design elements and building approaches that extend our understanding of best practice beyond the Bushfire Attack Level or BAL rating system. Tonight, we will be showcasing 3 bushfire resilient homes in detail and talking to those who designed them. There will be a short presentation on each, followed by a discussion between our expert Nigel and the architect involved. They will try to answer any questions you may have about the case study, but please be aware we may not be able to get to all of them. In the last half an hour, we'll bring the full panel together to discuss the topic of earth-coupled bushfire resilient homes, and I will be putting your questions to our experts. Please, during the session, you can put the question into the Zoom Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get to as many of them as we can. You may also use the chat window at the bottom right of the screen to make general contacts or contact our behind-the-scenes team. Some of you may find the content tonight slightly disturbing. Please make sure that if you need to, you can seek help from support services such as Beyond Blue or Lifeline. And if you feel like you might need it, take a break from the session, which will be recorded and put up on the Green Rebuild Toolkit website. Before we dive in, I also want to just take a moment to speak about Renew, the organisation behind the Beyond BAL project. Renew is a not-for-profit membership-based organisation that works to transform Australian homes for climate and energy resilience. We do this in many ways, including running free events like this one and our flagship Sustainable House Day event. We produce independent expert resources like the Green Rebuild Toolkit and the Getting Off Gas Toolkit, and we inspire and educate through our 2 magazines, Renew and Sanctuary, as we advocate for a fair energy transition on behalf of Australian households. We do all this with a very tiny and dedicated team of hardworking staff. We have been around for 40 years and we intend to stay around. We know that times are tough, but we encourage you to make a donation if you have found value in any of these events. You can also consider joining Renew as a member or taking out a subscription to one of our magazines. They are all very important and meaningful ways that you can support us to continue to enable important change Australia-wide. So we're going to get started. Firstly, we have Alvyn Williams from Soft Loud House Architects. Alvyn is based in coastal regional Victoria. He seeks to engage clients and communities in a values-driven dialogue, creating deeply responsive places. Alvyn develops an empathetic response to place, directing structure to mirror, merge, and converse with landscapes in a manner both soft and alive. His projects champion low consumption energy and resources combined with permaculture and regenerative design practices. Thank you, Alvyn. I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks, Rachel. And I'm speaking to you from the Bellarine Peninsula, which is Wadawurrung country. And I'm just going to share my screen now and jump into it straight away. So this was a project which is a house for my parents. It's in Steeles Creek. And you may have seen the house featured on Grand Designs, or there was another documentary produced by the ANU as well. And so we're talking about bushfire design from a place of experience. So the original house out on the farm that I grew up in, actually, a double-story house, metal roof, had a sort of combination of timber cladding, pine cladding, and metal cladding. And over the years was surrounded by increasingly lush gardens and timber decking, all to make it a more attractive and enjoyable place to live. The house didn't survive Black Saturday in 2009, and actually none of the structures on the property did survive. So this is a photograph of what was left afterwards. And actually it was, for me as an architect, it was very much a case study of how did different things survive? How did mud brick survive in a fire with that intensity? How did metal survive or not survive? And timber and brick buildings and so forth. But there was really nothing left on the property apart from an underground cellar after the fire. After the fire, my parents and other members of the family, they gathered together and we talked about, at the right time, of course, we talked about how to rebuild after the fire and what we could learn, the lessons we could learn. And which animals survived on the fire, which things in the environment did well after fire and regenerated quickly, and which things were slower. And we developed really a series of principles or patterns that we were going to follow. One of the things that happened was a double-story house was almost impossible to protect from fire. It almost needed a person for each side to protect the house. So we looked at definitely a single-story building. All the things that were left on the property that were useful were stored in an underground cellar that Mum had been very careful to, put precious things in every summer. And so obviously underground was another safe place. And then also just looked at the nature of the environment, like, things with lots of insulation seem to survive quickly. And if things were deep underground or were protected deeply, they could regenerate faster, that sort of thing. The other thing we looked at was where did the animals go and what actually happened in the environment. So this is the farm, the day after. And my parents said the animals had survived because they'd walked onto these patches of unburnt ground that were pretty hard bitten. It was a very hot, dry time of year. And the animals would be able to walk even onto burnt already patches that had burnt. And then they were quite safe after that. And so after the fire, we looked at putting together really a master plan, not just for how to, have a house that could survive or meet a BAL rating, but also the sort of house that they could leave and go to town and not really worry about. So a very resilient place. But there were a few other things as well. So we looked at how to make the farm function a little bit smoother by putting everything on one level. And also we considered them aging in place. They were, I think, in their 60s at the time and planning on living there for longer. So how could we make a place that was going to support them to do that? So you can see here that there's a dam north of the house that was already there. This is the place where a lot of the animals went to, out in the middle, which you can see from the red arrows is the furthest away from vegetation. Where the green square is the old vegetable gardens and gardens around the old house, which you can see is a lot closer to the gully there with eucalypts and native trees in. We looked at where the fire came from and what you could really anticipate fire behaviour in the future. And one of the things that Dad really was keen on was a window facing west so that they had some level of observation over that. There's one corner of the house that turns around from the north to the west. Obviously, farm sheds and somewhere to live were the earliest priority. So this is just, we need to set up those first few sheds and the school classroom to live in. and then into building the house. And so you can see here it's at that point of where a lot of the work's been done. The roof hasn't yet been covered. You can see the skylights and the chimneys sticking out and where the ground level will be in the future. And then from the back, you can see that's earth covered. So there was a gentle slope that we cut in to move the dirt to one side and put the house in and then recovered it. And it looks more like that today, where the plan is that in summer, the sheep can be used to graze down the grass around the house and really reduce the fire risk each year. Landscaping around the house has been kept to an absolute minimum with rocks and water and not much else. You can also see there's some very tough fire-resistant materials. So we've got blackbutt, which is one of the fire-resistant timbers from the Australian standard. It's high in silica, so it resists burning. Sandstone, and you can also see here recycled bricks from the original house. So the family were very keen to incorporate the arches that they had in the old house, and we spent a lot of time getting them to feel right. And you can see the steel fascias and things like that, unlike the Oregon fascias that had caught on fire at the first house. The one window that faces west, so it faces the higher risk area, has a metal screen made by Justin Purser. So it's got the bulrushes from one of the dams as a decoration, and then a perforated metal behind. So that can be closed to shield it from fire. And they have a picture of inside the house again, showing these recycled brick arches and the rendered walls. Another picture from inside. So the house is really operating in 3 layers. The first one with the arch windows, you can see, is a little bit like an earthship's conservatory or greenhouse. Then you have your middle layer, and that large sliding door is the thermal sort of barrier between the inside and outside. And then the back of the house is behind the clock, where there's a level of storage and bathrooms and laundry and things like that. And then that's a view of the house from the front with the dam. And hopefully I've fitted in my 5-minute time slot.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Alvyn, and thank you for sharing the journey that took to build that house. So I'm now going to invite Nigel Bell to join us. Nigel has been working closely with Renew to select the Beyond BAL case studies. Nigel brings a wealth of experience developed through 4 decades working as an architect in the fire-prone Blue Mountains, and has been a sustainability leader in the bushfire resilience field for more than 2 decades. He represents the Australian Institute of Architects on the 3 bushfire standard committees, and has just returned from California and the west coast of Canada researching their wildfire building response. If you in the audience have any questions that you would like to pose to Nigel or Alvyn, please put them into the Q&A box now and we'll get to them shortly.
Thanks, Rachel, and most particularly thank you, Alvyn. We were very taken by your project just because the thoroughness of your research, your background understanding, and your immediate response to what nature should be teaching us about where to live, how to live, and in your case, the animals directing where was safest. They could survive without any protection. And the fact that you were astute enough with your family to build on that and realize that this was the safest place to build. And then, again, the nice way you've obviously gone about as a family enterprise, leading the design and building, obviously, what's a very satisfying home. And, of course, like all earth-integrated homes, it's got a lot of structure. It has to, because of the weight of the roof. Mm-hmm. So it's got to be long life, loose fit, to use the jargon of previous decades, to amortize the amount of embodied energy to make those materials. You have done the right thing. You've got a house which can be changed and added or reconfigured in future decades according to other people's needs, apart from obviously doing nicely for yourself, or more particularly your family. So well done. A nice house, sustainable and highly bushfire resistant. So can I ask you a question or two? firstly, the aspect of what is the structure behind the wall and on the roof? Is it entirely concrete, or is there much steel or other materials?
Okay. When we looked at the house, one of the things that my parents are very keen on was to build an earthship. And talking with Michael Reynolds at the time, and we were talking through practicality and costs and all the other things, and the fact in Taos they don't need waterproofing or termite protection and things like that. What the decision was made was to go with a very conventional type of structure. So we weren't going to spend months and months ramming tires with soil and crushing aluminium cans and things like that, but to do something the Australian building industry is very familiar with. So the house is built not dissimilarly to an underground car park. So a concrete slab, core-filled blockwork walls, and a concrete roof.
There's a bit
very,
more
very
skill
simple structure.
and style. Sorry.
Yeah. So there's no like sometimes engineers will put steel framing and that sort of thing, but it was kept really simple. So like you're saying, for flexibility and change, and also to make a system that was understandable and quick to build, speed being very important.
So that was because they were very keen to get back into the house as soon as they could after the fire? Right. Yes. It's interesting. In my experience, many of the people who build quickly don't necessarily do the research and the homework that you and your family has. Typically, in my experience, people want to put this exactly the same house back that they lived in. But unfortunately, it's never the same later, quite apart from the extra cost and difficulty of having, the BAL, Bushfire Attack Level building regulations needing to be applied in most cases. Anyway, moving forward, the thermal practice you've got, as you said, 3 layers. The first layer has single glazing across from the dam and north, so that will have maximum heat gain or heat loss. And obviously the sun is falling on concrete and tiles on that first layer. And then from what you've told me, or I understand, the layer of sliding doors all the way across that facade is double glazed, and therefore, depending how you open and close them, you're getting warmth or coolth according to the season. So it works well, I take it. How has your family reacted?
Dad's actually, I think the house is getting on for about 13 years now, and Dad's always monitored the temperature, and it's either 22 degrees or 23 degrees inside, which shows that it's thermally working. One of the interesting things is that we couldn't get it originally to meet the 5-star energy rating, in the days when this was only 5-star, because that energy rating system is based on very conventional construction. Everybody laughed, but we've included insulation at the back of the house to insulate it from the earth. But to make sure that we had enough of a thermal flywheel, that insulation is actually 2 meters behind the wall of the house.
But the regulators could still tick a box.
But it could still be ticked off, that's right.
Yeah. Sure. That's unfortunately what you sometimes have to do, because innovation can be decades ahead of everyday practice. So it's often a matter of needing a person with skill like yourself, Alvyn, to deal with it creatively. Well done. Now, another obvious thing about that house is having the dam in front of it, because obviously the water has high thermal capacitance, which means that it doesn't heat up or cool down very quickly, just as the earth around your building. So it helps moderate temperature, but also you've got the airflow across the water coming in. Can you tell us about the impact of that?
So I'm not sure about that. I don't think it would have a huge bearing on temperature of the ground, just because it's so stable underground there. Like, one of the things that has a bigger impact is that we have some air pipes that run underground for ventilation. And then that in winter preheats the air to whatever the ground temperature is, probably around 17 degrees. And then in summer, it would cool it to that same level.
Can you explain a bit more?
What we were conscious of is to try to reflect a little bit more light into the house. And so at the very front of the house is actually another water element that obviously in winter it's wetter and that fills up with water, and it does reflect some light back. But we were quite careful in designing the sun angle. So the windows at the front of the house are very tall in that conservatory area, whereas the next row of windows are standard height, 2.1 meters. And we were careful to make sure the winter sun actually hit the back wall.
Yes, that's good. But just explain a bit more about the pipes. Many people listening in probably don't quite understand what you're meaning there and the benefit.
If I compare it to a passive house has what's called heat recovery ventilation, where the temperature inside the house is retained, but fresh air is brought in constantly. And we looked at having a system that was simpler than that didn't have any moving parts, just using the thermal properties of the soil. Now, this wouldn't work if you're at Mount Buller, where the soil might be 9 degrees or 10 degrees. Might help you a bit in summer, but it's not going to make it comfortable inside in winter. But in a lot of sort of central Victoria, the ground temperature is much more even and much more workable with in that sense.
But what you've got is an air intake, 20 metres, 50 metres away from the building.
That's right, 50 metres away.
And it goes deep in the ground?
2 metres deep, where the temperature is more stable. Mm-hmm. And then the pipes run up on a very shallow slope so that any condensation inside in summer actually runs back out the end. And there's a drainage area. And they run into a ventilation box in the back sort of storage area, which is then ducted to all the different rooms.
Right. So it's using natural systems to get the most out of the air temperature and the ground temperature to, again, minimise the need for electrical or mechanical or electronic devices.
Yeah. And jokingly, we call it Roman air conditioning because it is a very classical principle.
And it's worked for thousands of years.
And not a lot of people use it, Alvyn. So it's totally great to see it in place in such a beautiful house. I've got a couple quick questions, mostly around water. So does this house collect water, or how did you stop it from getting into the building from the top?
Good question. So firstly, there's enough sheds on the farm. I think there's something like 150,000 litres of water stored and collected from the farm shed. So the house didn't need to catch water for drinking. And so the water that is caught on the metal roof at the front, that just runs into the dam. In terms of waterproofing, yes, there's the soil there is a gravelly clay over rock and gets a lot of springs that come up through it. And so a lot of care was taken with the waterproofing of the roof and the back wall and the drainage around there to make sure there was no leaks.
Did it require special services, or was it something that a builder could deal with in terms of that kind of?
Again, my parents were owner builders, so they did that themselves. And what I noticed quite a lot is owner builders take a lot more care with things like that because they know it's on them if they need to do a repair, in 20 years' time.
Totally. There was one.
Water always manages to find one little weak spot somewhere, doesn't it?
It takes a pinprick. That's right.
Yep. Sorry, Rachel.
No, you're good. And I guess that goes to, like, do you have any way of costing said project or carbon footprinting said project? Considering they were owner builders, did they keep a tab of what it cost?
Oh, yeah, they kept a tab of budget. They obviously had some insurance from the old house.
Yeah.
And so I think at the time it was around about a $600,000 budget. And no one could believe that. Even then, they said it must have cost more than that. But, again, own a building and being very careful with your resources. And, having a bit of community support as well. The concreter was from up the road and the bricklayer was sort of already in the team doing work for the family and that sort of thing. So...
and have you found that featuring on Grand Designs has led to interest in this kind of structure?
Very little, I think. Everybody said you'll be inundated with work after Grand Designs, but phone didn't really start ringing. Yeah, so I think what it did is it confirmed to the clients that we already had that the work that we were doing was valid in the world, in a sense, and so they felt good about that, but it didn't lead to a rash of new clients.
All right. We might call it there and we'll come back to you at the end. Thank you so much, Alvyn, for presenting your parents' beautiful house. We're going to move on to the next case study, which is with Jamie Brennan. From 6B Design. So Jamie has been a part of sustainable architecture practice 6B Design for 25 years, located in the Blue Mountains, with projects to the east in Sydney, throughout the Blue Mountains, and in regional areas to the west of the Blue Mountains. 6B's design focuses on sustainability, brings innovative solutions to both bushfire and sustainability. I will hand it over to you, Jamie. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm presenting from Darug and Gundungurra country. So I'm from the Blue Mountains, where I live and work, and where we gain experience from bushfire design, because the Blue Mountains is a string of towns along a ridge which is surrounded by national park on all sides. So I'd just like to start with site planning, because good site planning can help reduce costs and give you some good protection from bushfire. So in the photo, you can see the house where that the pink marker is. You can also see the escarpment on the bottom left of the photo. So it's a fairly short, so that escarpment's 400 metres high, and then you come to the bush, which is just a Blue Mountains heath. So it's a fairly low bushfire threat, which meant we could get away with a 10-metre setback, which we needed to have because everything below that's environmental protection as well. And that 10-metre setback gave us a BAL 40. And then, because this is an infill lot which has residents on two sides and the street to the north, you can start to use shielding, which means the area towards the street, the courtyard entry area, is shielded from the bushfire threat or from the bush. And under the Australian standard at the moment, you can drop the BAL rating down. So in this case, the area, the sides facing the bush, or BAL 40, and the side facing the street is BAL 29, which can help a fair bit in the cost of construction. For example, if you had metal, say you're in BAL flame zone and you drop down to BAL 40, you would save a lot on windows by not needing shutters. You'd save a lot on metal cladding by not needing the extra layers behind the cladding that you need in flame zone. In this case, that meant that the clients could put in a hardwood door at the entry under BAL 29, which they designed and made themselves. So the next slide is looking at bushfire protection and passive cooling. On the bushfire side, we have this lap pool, which has an infinity water edge, and so the pool's raised above the ground. And that works quite effectively for this site because the bushfire threat was a 1.5 to 2 metre heath. So there was no canopy fire coming through here. That pool is also used as a static water supply for the bushfire tankers, with a Storts fitting coming out the side of the pool that you can fill up a tanker. And for cooling, you can get the evaporative cooling effect with the ventilation coming over the the pool and through the lower windows, and then rise up through the stairwell through a stack cooling effect. Also upstairs, we have low windows that open on the low side, and then we have high windows up above the fireplace there. We also split that roof so that the entry roof can have solar panels on it, because north was to the front, but the escarpment views were to the south. And by splitting the roof meant that we could still get solar access through these high windows into the living area, whilst having an entry roof that had solar panels on it. And these high windows work quite effectively because hot air rises. So if you bring in cool air at night time, because in the Blue Mountains, it's about 1,000 meters above, or in Lura for this building, it's about 1,000 meters above sea level. The evenings cool down, so you can bring that cool air through the building and flush out the walls, which are rammed earth, and release the hot air out of the high windows. In winter, the solar access comes through these high windows and can be absorbed into the rammed earth walls, which are the internal walls. And the last slide is just looking at energy efficiency and how that goes hand in hand with bushfire, with a tight fitting building. This building used rammed earth, which is 300 millimeters thick, for energy efficient reasons. But in the bushfire standard, any masonry that's greater than 90 millimeters complies with flame zone. So a standard brick would comply with flame zone. The rammed earth is a single skinned external wall, so you need to increase the thickness to 300 millimeters to get the correct thermal swing for the Blue Mountains, so that as the building cools down at night, the coolness doesn't come into the building, because by the time it hasn't reached the inside, because the next day it starts to warm up, so it starts to draw it back out again. This building also had composite windows, which were rated to BAL 40, and they've got aluminium on the outside for the bushfire protection, as well as to reduce maintenance, and then timber, big ash on the inside, which increases the insulation and also gives a nice warm feeling. They're double glazed and low E glass, because this faces southwest, so we needed that extra sun protection. And that's it. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jamie, for presenting that beautiful house. If you have any questions for Jamie about the case study or for Nigel, please pop them in the Q&A now.
Hi, Jamie. Lovely house. Take an eco home tour to that house some years back, because yes, it's an outstanding example for what it is, where it is, and again, the very thoughtful understanding of how to use natural passive systems of airflow. You're a NatHERS assessor, I know, and so you can actually do the number crunching as well to prove and establish that how efficiently it works in a sustainability sense. So well done. Now, my first question to you is just a point of contrast between the other two houses we're looking at this evening. Both are underground. They've got earth over the roof. Your house, obviously, is a lovely two-story house with earth. So can you perhaps talk to the audience about what that means in terms of formwork, ease, difficulty of construction when you're trying to go up with a rammed earth house compared to the other ones which are going down?
Yeah, so I suppose from a site analysis point of view, this site is quite flat from the building site. The soils are thin up here, and then you hit sandstone. So going into the ground wasn't really an issue because you wouldn't have any exposed faces because you didn't have a hill to work with. From a two-story point of view, the contractors needed to brace. They're about 6 metre high walls, so they needed to get a scissor lift involved to lift up the earth into the formwork and to ram them in. They then had to brace the rammed earth onto the slab until the structure went up, and then once the first floor went up, that braced all the walls together. I can't remember if there were more to that.
Sure. The house is about 9 years old, I seem to remember.
Yeah.
Sure.
Something like that.
Yep. Okay. So for the audience, it's just like concrete in terms of you do the formwork with the normal supports and bracings and then the internal links. However, instead of pouring in very expensive, high embodied energy concrete, Jamie, you are using relatively local earth mixed in with what kind of stabilizer? That's mixed together, typically, I think, tell me if I'm wrong, but using a backhoe or a bobcat. And then again, it's just dropped in, and they these days tend to use pneumatic pumps to compress it.
Well, pneumatic rammer. And it's quite a dry mixture. The drier, the better for the ramming. We used Cara Gold, which is from a local quarry. That gives you see if that will zoom. No. Anyway. But that gave you the colour that sort of matches the Blue Mountains escarpment as well. Another reason to go 2 stories was because of the views.
Sure.
So the living area was up on the top story as well, because it looks towards the back of the Three Sisters and
the grand views.
Views you want to take advantage of.
Sure. So in going up, you obviously had a much heavier wind loading than commonly, being on the escarpment. So any comment about that? And did that affect, in an engineering sense, the composition of the soil? Did you use cement, off-white cement, or did you use something else?
Yeah, the engineer did specify it was 5 to 15% cement. They used about 7 to 9% when we did some testing. There were a fair few corners in the building that braced it, so wind wasn't a huge problem. Another reason to go up higher was to get the solar access up through the roof as well. But yeah, and I suppose the hardest thing about the job is that which I didn't show many photos, maybe the last one, there were some corner windows as well that the clients wanted to get views from 2 angles, and that required some structural gymnastics with steel beams and cantilevers that came out of the rammed earth to give you sort of no structure on the corners while supporting earth.
Cool. Sorry, Rachel.
We've had a fair few questions about the insulation. Jamie, could you talk a little bit about that?
There's no insulation in the rammed earth walls. There is some on the metal cladding parts, There's insulation in the windows being double glazed and the roof, but it's just the thickness of the rammed earth walls that is used as to create a thermal swing, so that by the time the building cools down overnight, it doesn't cool. That coolness from the outside nighttime temperature doesn't reach the inside, because by the time it moves through that amount of thickness, the next day has started, and it pulls it back. So it's just getting the thickness right with rammed earth.
But does that also mean that the house itself has to have a lot of solar gain in order to stop it in order to allow it to be able to heat up in winter, especially? Yeah. Yes.
And there's a fair few internal rammed earth walls as well, so that those internal walls can collect that solar gain and store it overnight as well. So it's,
So the lesson is really, with rammed earth, you need to look very closely at your location, your solar access, solar gain, and your temperature variation to have the right mix, the right thickness of wall, as well as hopefully passive solar design. Is that reasonable?
Yeah. The more passive solar design, the more glass you can have. So the thermal mass allows you to have more glass than a conventional building, because it gives you these thermal swings. So the building will be heating up and absorbing the heat during the daytime, and then 2 to 4 hours later at nighttime, as the outside temperature cools down, it starts to release the heat on the inside. As long as you got that solar access, as you mentioned before.
And what about the fire resistance of rammed earth? I mean, I know rammed earth has been around for quite some time in Australia. Did you use any evidence from other rammed earth buildings on?
No, well, the Australian standard only requires a 90 mil masonry wall, and rammed earth is considered masonry, as is concrete and bricks. So it complies by 3 times the requirement for flame zone in that sense.
All right. Did you have any more questions, Nigel? We might.
Not at the moment.
All right. Thank you so much, Jamie. We'll bring you back at the end for a Q&A, and we're going to move on to our final case study, which is Dale Lloyd from Brownhill Creek. Dale Lloyd from ShelterSpace with the Brownhill Creek project. So Dale is a practicing building designer and draftsperson with over 15 years experience in Victoria and South Australia in bespoke design, construction, and sustainable building practices, having worked on a large range of residential projects. Dale has experience working on site with earth-sheltered homes, straw bale builds, and traditional residential housing. He lives and works in the beautiful Adelaide Hills. Over to you, Dale.
Thank you. I'll just share my screen. I'll be presenting tonight our Brownhill Creek project. This is a 3-bedroom, 3 living room, 2-bath house that came in at about $1 million, which was about $4,500 per metre. Here at ShelterSpace, we've been designing solely earth-sheltered houses for over 40 years, and through our construction systems and methodologies, we have a house that, when designed properly, can combat the 4 major elements, which is fire, earth, wind and water. And this comes standard with all our houses, as you'll see going forward. So the property is on the traditional lands of the Kaurna people. It is just south of Adelaide Hill, the Adelaide CBD, where the suburbs meet the beautiful Adelaide Hills. This property was accessed by a no-through, very tight and long, narrow council road, as you can see by the red line here, and it was at the end of this road. So we were fortunate enough with this property that the owners grew up on the land. So that brought forward the knowledge of all the pros and cons that the site had. The property is 5.5 hectares and had an existing driveway and an existing house, shed and second dwelling with it. One of the major hurdles we had with this property was getting CFS vehicles to even go up the council road, because at the end of it, there was no area for them to turn around in. The existing driveway also had a very tight hairpin turn when it met that Brown Hill Creek Road. So we managed to get an alternative solution for the CFS vehicles to do a 3-point turn at the bottom of this Brown Hill Creek Road to then gain access up the driveway. One of the pros of the site was there was already an existing levelled cut that the parents of the owner had done to build an orchard and garden. So we utilised that space to position the new earth shuttle dwelling. Here's a quick shot of the slope and the hill going back into the distance, and you can just see on the left here the flat area that was the existing cut. Again, here where the ute and the truck are is the existing cut and the beautiful views to the northeast, and then the hill behind, which they started to cut into here on the photo on the right. So with all our houses, there is a concrete shell that is the core of its success. We start by cutting into the hill, which you can see in this photo, and then start with a concrete slab on the ground. In this project, we had a 400mm thick concrete wall in certain parts, and we're very conscious of the amount of that in the house to make sure that it continued to perform how we wanted it to. Here's a shot of the concrete slab down, the rammed earth walls in, and the steel structure that would hold up the concrete roof. Here are the concrete blockwork walls, which are 190mm thick core-filled blockwork walls. And here you can see how this is almost a 4-metre deep cut at the back of the house. In this shot is the concrete roof and the 3 courtyards you can see protruding through. And the photo on the right shows you the great solar access of the site, where the windows at the front facade bringing light into the back of the house, and then also the courts and the light coming down through those. Once the waterproofing and drainage is done over the concrete shell, we then backfill with soil around the 3 sides of the house and put sand on the roof to create a lightweight but very quick draining medium that also gives us that thermal stability and insulation that we want for the dwelling. It's also evident here, you can see the steel skeleton of the light court roofs going in, and then a photo on the right of that finished product where this part of the dwelling is not considered the external building envelope, so it doesn't have to be bushfire rated, but inside the light courts themselves are BAL rated, which I'll show you a bit further on. A shot here of the finished house with 3 bedrooms, having one side or one elevation that is only exposed is where we apply the appropriate BAL rated cladding to the client's brief and budgets. In this case, we use stack bond blockwork, thermally broken double glazed windows and fire rated shutters, and the windows were fire rated as well. And then a shot from behind once the completed house was done. A shot of the front once the owners had moved in. This house was completed back in January this year. And so all the roof water that we capture on our houses is directed towards the front of the house, because we don't want to create any more hydrostatic pressure that's applied to the back of the walls. So that any roof water is directed to the front through downpipes and put into tanks either side of the dwelling, which is then used for firefighting. Just a quick shot of the rammed earth walls and the entry. And then a shot from the side showing how these houses integrate into the hill and really have that low profile aesthetic that we're known for. At this point, I'd like to thank Jackson and his wonderful team at Enduro Builders who did a marvellous job with the build. And it was through that collaboration with Jackson and the client that this floor plan evolved from, where we determined the layout of the house with the rammed earth walls and making those elements of the steel and the concrete roof and the spans that are required from them work to our floor plan. And as you can see, we ended up with all the bedrooms and living areas on the eastern side of the house to take advantage of the views and that solar access, which meant that the rooms along the back of the house were all service rooms connected to the light courts for natural light and ventilation that we are required to do to meet the building code. I've got a highlighted plan here to show our features of our houses that make them good in fire, but also in the depths of winter and the heat of summer perform really well. So the green here you can see is the back wall and side walls that are the 190mm concrete and then also covered with soil. The dashed red line then indicates the only facade that is exposed to the elements, including the roof and the floor. Everything is earth covered with only that one side. So that means we can focus all of our energy and our resources on that one elevation to protect us from fire. The purple box is one of the features we put in all our houses, especially when they're in high bushfire areas, which is an airlock. And this gives us an entry point that the occupants can come in and out of before and after the fire front. And if they happen to go out before the fire front to grab pets or whatever they needed to rush back inside, any embers that did follow them in would be contained in that airlock space and could be put out. And the same with when they're in the depths of winter and the heat of summer. This airlock means that the outside temperature is not brought into the house. Along that front facade is where there's blue boxes indicate the windows, where we have our multiple layers of protection from the bushfire rated roller shutters and windows. A little cross section through the house to again further explain the concrete shell shown in green. Nigel might be able to confirm this, but I believe it's around 80 to 90% of house fires when there is a bushfire event start by the Emperor attack in the roof space. And we just don't have a conventional roof space with an earth shuttle dwelling because of the nature of the building. So a lot of the fire threat is gone because of the earth shuttle roof that we've got. And then the next point of entry in house fires is through the window. So again, the reason behind the double layer of protection for our windows is that we have a fire-rated window and a fire-rated shutter, and that shutter is to protect those windows from any projectiles that are coming along in that fire event from breaking the glass and then creating a point of entry for the embers. You can see here our light courts at the back, creating that light and ventilation into the back of the house. That is BAL rated on the inside, and the light court roof, which is built from metal, glass, and 6mm toughened glass and a steel shell, protects that court as much as it can in a fire. And then I'll throw back to you, Nigel, and just play this short video of the drone showing our houses.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dale. It is a beautiful house. If anyone has any questions for Dale on the Brownhill Creek Earth Sheltered House, please put them in the Q&A, and I'll invite Nigel to talk about your project.
Thank you. Okay, well done, Dale. Your company's 40 years experience shows, because you've now got a very sophisticated approach in terms of the design, the planning, and obviously the construction system. So it's much there to be admired, and obviously, again, a very livable house. So just two things. You mentioned about alternative solution, and most people listening in probably don't quite understand what that means or what the implications are. So could you perhaps just simply explain what that means?
Yeah, so obviously with the BAL ratings Australia-wide now, there's certain things that you have to meet to be able to pass any house or extension. And we've often found with our clients, especially because of the nature of our rural properties, it's just almost impossible to apply those rules and requirements to the property. And in this case, and in most of our challenges, we find road access the biggest problem. And so we had numerous conversations with the CFS on this project to try and work out how we give them access that is safe and achievable on a property that almost had no access point. So yeah, we went through that process with the CFS to say, look, how can we resolve this? Because there is a property here with a house that needs to be defended, and they were willing to help us by admitting that it was a road that, like that Brownhill Creek road, you'd almost not get a fire truck up it by itself. So yeah, they were very amenable to that solution.
I imagine only because you had a highly fire-safe building at the end, because for good and obvious reasons, fire authorities, people, these men and women in trucks, the last thing they want to do is head up bushy, difficult roads and be trapped at the end if they can't get out quickly enough. And of course, there's many a house that can't possibly be defended,
yep.
But you've got a house which is highly defendable in its own right. You've built it in. So I'm sure that gave them reassurance compared to if you're trying to do, just a standard little timber box on top. I'm sure they wouldn't have given you the slightest chance of an approval.
No. And I mean, the road was also a challenge from a construction point of view. So we had to make sure that we could get concrete trucks up first, as well as firefighting vehicles. And as part of that alternative solution, we were required to put in a manifest box at the very bottom of the driveway, which had maps of the property and where that static water supply was, where the passing bay was, and where the turnaround was at the very top of the driveway, to make sure that, because in a fire event, this is all covered in smoke, and the people defending and trying to protect the house need to know where to go.
Exactly. And certainly states and territories, mostly through their planning regulations, are often very strict about the width of the road, the height, the clearance height for trees, and then turning circles. Because certainly some states are more relaxed, other states are very particular. And you don't get an approval unless, for example, you have a full truck turning circle. New South Wales wouldn't allow a 3-point turn, for example. So, on it goes. Your light courts are an interesting innovation, because obviously you're getting light into back rooms, you're creating the stack effect for natural ventilation, and you've got the possibility of some small-scale landscaping planting within them. No eucalypts, nothing that's going to burn too much, but just all the nice things that if you're looking in your bathroom, you can have a few plants outside or that sort of thing. So I think that's very effective in that design. Is that something you fairly universally have come to adopt?
Yeah, and I think what Paul found, especially very early on when he started this company, back in the late 70s, is there was a building code that meant that the light and ventilation for habitable rooms had to be met. And not just from that point of view, but from our occupants and the people who live in these houses, they wanted insurance that it wasn't going to be dark and it wasn't going to smell and be damp. And that's where these light courts really sing, because they, like you said, act like pockets or little chimneys at the back of the house that draw that air through, but also bring down that light into the back of the house almost more effectively than an above ground house. It's quite surprising, and usually the first question of our prospective clients is how dark are they, and is why we have the fortunate ability to have open days where we show clients through multiple houses of ours to sort of show them how bright and airy they are.
And as a company that's doing some work interstate, how have you found the acceptance of earth-integrated buildings in terms of regulations, in terms of finding the right tradies, the right engineer? How's it gone? It's challenging, but the way that we approach it is with our interstate clients, we often fly or drive to them and make sure that we spend 2 or 3 days with the clients to come up with a concept first and foremost, but also for us to see the site, which is paramount to a successful design, and also gives me the ability while I'm there to hunt around and investigate local trades. And especially local engineers is an absolute must, because they've got the local knowledge of the soil, and that can really play a big part in the footings, especially of these houses. So from that point of view, that's a really successful program that we have, where we go to each site and meet each client. From an approval point of view, we've never had one knocked back, because most of the time, the low profile, like I said before, and the way these houses perform and adapt into the environment is what the councils want. Our biggest hurdles we find are the driveways and septic tanks, funny enough. Nothing to do with the house. Okay. Rachel.
Yeah, can we just ask before, we're not going to have that much time to do more audience questions until the open Q&A, but how much of the budget was spent on earthworks, would you say, roughly?
Oh, that's a good question. In this case, it was slightly less. Typically, I don't know how to put this into a percentage, but in the past, it's been around $30,000 to excavate for the house, put the soil above the cut, build everything, and then bring that soil back and bring in sand and put it on the roof. So someone can do the maths. I can't do that quickly.
That's all right. So not an inordinate amount, considering it looked like tricky.
No, and we've definitely had owner builders in the past who have purchased tractors and machinery that they want to use on their rural property, but have managed to cut their own tracks and cut their own house site and excavation to save that amount of money and end up with a tractor in the end.
And loan it to someone else when it's their turn to do the cut. Yeah. Awesome. All right. Thanks, Dale. We might keep moving. There are a fair few questions rolling in, so I know that we're going to have a really juicy discussion with everyone, and we'll use the rest of the time we have together to answer some of the questions. So I'll invite back Jamie and Alvyn. Thanks for joining us. So there's so many ways we can move into this discussion, but I guess the question that a lot of people might want to know, and I don't know who might be best to answer this considering all of your builds have similarities and differences, would be about the trade-off for thermal performance in terms of earth-covered homes. So whether it's cost or whether it's performance, do you think building in this particular kind of design is worthwhile? So maybe, I don't know, Alvyn, do you want to start with that one?
Yeah, look, I would say that when you're talking about one facade of a building and the rest of the facades are fairly cheap, that the cost of an earth shelter building is not dramatically more than some of the typical architectural designs that you would see.
Fair enough.
In terms of thermal performance, there's no loss at all. It's a benefit rather than a loss. And every time we design them, now these days we put them through the Passive House software, and we're shocked to see 3 kilowatt hours per square meter of heating per year and things like numbers like that are just unheard of with conventional construction.
So,
and I think especially with an earth sheltered house, you're getting multiple benefits out of a single solution or a single build style. So looking forward to the ongoing costs, our houses don't require any aircon and minimal heating depending on where you're located. So that coupled with the bushfire resilience of it means they are suited to really high bushfire areas, but also from an energy point of view, you're using that soil temperature to heat and cool the house.
Mm-hmm. And then the other thing is that there's unsaid costs, because a metal roof is warranted to last for 20, 25 years. And so in an underground house, you've got your envelope, which is really quite well protected from degradation from ultraviolet light and wind and weather and those sorts of things. So there might be some of those things that people don't factor into the cost of a conventional dwelling, that, in the lifespan of an underground house, they might have replaced their roof 4 times.
Mm.
There was also a lot of questions about insulation, but an earth building works quite differently than an insulated building, because an insulated building is designed to exclude you from the outside and control the inside. So you can heat and cool it quickly, but you need to keep putting energy into it, whereas a earth building changes the thermal swing to a longer time frame. And you can use that to your advantage with correct solar access. I think a lot of I'm a NatHose assessor, but a lot of the simulation tools are focused on insulation, not on the overall performance of a building.
I mean, this has been a problem for a very long time in terms of earth sheltered, but it makes me wonder, I was there at the same session that you were probably at, Alvyn, in 2009, when Mike Reynolds came out and talked about Kinglake and said there should be no reason why people wouldn't want to build an earth sheltered home in a high bushfire prone region, but yet we're 15 years down the track and there's not a whole lot of examples. So why do we think that it hasn't taken off in the way that these beautiful houses have? I mean, we just talked about the higher cost point, but then what else is it that's not working for people? Is it because of the orientation and the only having windows in one side, or?
Well, can I say, it's well known across Australia that people are super conservative in acceptance of things that are different. I mean, I was in Sydney the other day looking at Habitat Pet and Sevet Home, and of the, circa 1980. And the comment I made to my clients was, yes, they sold too few of them. Everyone admired them. It was, traffic jams in that suburb in the northern part of Sydney back in the day, but not many people signed up. They all tended to want something related to what they grew up in. So, yes, it's a fundamental problem. And then industry is not, the construction side of it is not quick adopters by and large. They want other people to experiment, sort out the problems, and then, only then will the average builder take a step forward to do something different. So no, we're a super conservative society when it comes to housing.
Do you agree, Dale?
Yes, definitely. I think, especially early on in, I think, Paul's career, he had to take out his own building license to build the first, probably 20 or 30 of these houses because no builder wanted to go near them. And so the majority of our clients are owner builders. Only recently, probably in the last 5 years or so, have our houses been built by builders. And that's one of the reasons why Paul uses, and like Alvyn said before, conventional building practices, because for any builder to not balk at the idea of building an underground house, once we sit down with them and show, look, this is just a concrete slab on ground. It's like a brick veneer house, except the brick is doing the load-bearing work rather than the stud. And if your concrete has got commercial experience, they will eat this up, no worries. We will back you with the waterproofing regime that we have established, and they go from there. So once we show them how to build it and how we've done it, they usually are on board. If they're a builder who likes to, think outside the box in the first place. But yeah, the challenges I think people's budgets are one of our biggest hurdles too. They've often only got a certain amount that these houses will often need to be smaller than they want, and that can often be a big problem too.
But the other key point is obviously you need northern exposure predominantly for solar design, solar aspect, and obviously a sloping site, ideally. You don't necessarily want to create a mound. You want to have a landform, which most typically is going to be rural or regional, rather than being a suburban block, but you never know.
But is that why people balk at that idea? Because convention, like my layman's understanding of bushfire goes, you don't build on a racing slope. So is that part of the sort of mentality that has to change in terms of people not wanting to build on those kind of slopes because they think it's dangerous and that the house won't be able to protect them?
Well, you don't build on top. That's clear. Building further down, it's a different scenario. And then, as our speakers tonight have explained very nicely, when you only have one facade facing the likely fire front, it's far easier to have the right controls to make it relatively safe. But what do the other gentlemen have to say about that?
I think what I would add to it is it's awareness. And I don't think most people know what the choices are that they have.
Sure.
It's why events like this are good.
And I think often we have people come to us just purely wanting to know the figure of square metre rate without really thinking about what goes into creating that number, and not knowing that if they've compared it to an above ground house that might be half the price, realising that if you've got to build an above ground house in this same environment, there's a lot more that goes into it. If it's a sloping site, there's often retaining walls that aren't put into that build cost for an above ground house, or it's hard to compare apples with apples when thinking about an earth shuttered house versus an above ground house.
Dale, I'd add to that though that like the basic standard of housing in Australia is incredibly poor, and it is. The more people die in Australia from heat and cold than do in places with much more extreme climates. And as an architect who's been focused on having a higher quality built environment, there's not a dramatic difference between building a good quality house that's underground or not underground. But you are raising the bar. It's got higher levels of insulation. It's got more ethical materials and more local materials and things like that.
Absolutely. What about specialist subcontractors too, Dale? I mean, the Earth Building Association of Australia has a list of people who have lots of experience. What's the feeling across the panel about, a conventional builder, should we say, but able to rely upon a good, experienced earth building specialist subby?
For the rammed earth part of it, or just for an earth shuttered house?
No, the rammed earth bit I'm thinking of particularly, because that's obviously there's technique and knowledge behind that.
Yes, absolutely. This was probably my first project that had rammed earth elements into it, and so I had lengthy discussions with the builder and the subcontractor that he used for all his rammed earth work, especially where it integrated with the steelwork to work out, the best way to do that with our houses, the best, thickness of wall and the amount of rammed earth wall as a percentage versus the rest of the house came down to the subcontractor who done it and his experience. So I think that's vital with almost any trade, to be honest, or subcontractor.
Oh, and how did you go, Jamie?
I think, I've done lots of different alternative materials, so from hempcrete to straw to rammed earth. And every time it's looking for the specialist contractor early on, when the client mentions a product. Also finding a good engineer because you're going into the alternative material pathway in the Building Code of Australia, or National Construction Code. So you often need an engineer to do that alternative assessment as well. Or the product supplier, the contractor sometimes can provide that, depending on the council. So I think that's where you should start, with the specialists, and get to know the materials, and then you can design around the benefits of the material.
Sorry, I was just going to say some of the specialist earth building people I've come to know are also very good at varying what the mix is. So it's not just earth or the lowest percentage of off-white concrete cement, the better, but they're using other admixtures to make effectively a lighter, more energy efficient mix. Because typically earth as a whole, by the time it's rammed, it's very dense, very heavy, very fireproof. But that's the point. As an insulator, using the R rating system, which is what regulations are based around, R for resistance to heat flow, it never features well, because as Jamie touched upon, and I think Alvyn did too, it's the regulations are based on everyday materials and solid mass materials which change the internal climate over weeks and months. That's something they can't measure. So yes, there are ways to adapt it and still tick the box, but usually you need an alternative solution, meaning an experienced engineer, and perhaps with a good designer or architect to make it work fully.
There was a question earlier about how do sprinklers feature in a Beyond BAL project. So I know we talked a little bit about water in your project, Jamie, and we did talk a little bit about water infiltration in the earth-covered ones, but are sprinklers as good as shutters, or do you go for shutters every time?
Well, we can't use sprinklers in New South Wales as an alternative solution anymore. We used to be able to 15 years ago, I think it was, or even longer. But yeah, so it is definitely a Beyond BAL option, because it can't be used for a BAL option. And I think it's the way you use them that can get tricky, so if the owner puts the sprinklers on as soon as they hear the fires coming and it's 2 or 3 hours away and they've run out of water, then you don't get the best result, and you have to use them, half an hour to an hour in front of the fire front. So whether you're there turning it on or you're doing it remotely, all those things have to be thought through, or whether they go off on a heat sensor or something like that. Mm-hmm. So they are a good option but can only really be used, immunosophiles, as an extra option beyond the requirements.
Yes, there is no regulatory concession whatsoever. There is attempts led by me and others to get the existing standard, which is virtually not used, to get upgraded, but there's many technical issues and a lot of resistance from fire authorities because it's seen to be entirely an optional extra. No one wants to give any benefit in terms of, for example, having a flame zone house considered as BAL 40 because you've got a gee whiz sprinkler system. They just won't go there. There are so many variables that Jamie touched upon in having a successful system. That said, there are, of course, fantastic examples where even the simplest homemade one has saved a house here and there. So, yeah, the debate continues.
I think the other thing that's important too is that if you get a flame zone rating for a material, it basically says it's going to last 30 minutes in a fire environment. And as gets hotter and climate changes, we could be looking at houses needing to not just survive one fire, but maybe a fire every year. And whether just relying on a 30-minute solution is the right thing, or whether we need to go, as the title of this talk is, beyond BAL completely, so that we're actually making resilient buildings, is a big question. The Australian standard doesn't go there, and the various planning codes don't really go there yet.
And I think, like with a lot of aspects of our buildings, there's multiple levers of protection, from water, but also from fire, because like Alvyn just mentioned, you want to have a building that, you don't, if you do go through a fire, you only have to do, surface fixing to bring it back up to the house that you had originally. And I think going back to the sprinklers, you've, like Jamie said, I think the success of a sprinkler is putting it on just before the fire event, so it dampens everything down. Once that fire front hits, any water is just going to evaporate if it's been sprayed. And then once that fire front is gone, then the sprinklers hopefully have survived and can be turned back on to put out the fire, the spot fires that are out the front.
And I say the one system I put in during the last Black Summer bushfire, it was a flame zone house. The client had money and he was so horrified by what was happening in late 2019, he asked us to upgrade and put in a sprinkler system. Key problem, not many people are competent to design it and necessarily build it. Obviously, plumbing is the connections, but to the design. What was put in that house was using temperature sensors that the Catherine wheel heads would sprinkle onto the roof, but mostly the vulnerable areas of the glass and openings below the eave, so it was covering both, and would pulse for 20 minutes. And then when the next height and temperature, it would go full bore for 10 minutes and then go back to pulsing. So that was the system set up there. But the problem is, as Dale alluded to, we already had a 20,000 litre concrete water tank in the ground before there's any talk about a sprinkler system. And even that system would go through 14,000 litres in an hour if there wasn't recycling. So yes, it's an important issue, but it's not simple.
And I might just, we're nearly at the end, but I had one sort of, teaser question, I guess, for all of you designers would be, what would you say is the least best performing aspect of your earth sheltered home, or the aspect that you don't sell up front to your clients?
I'm happy to go first.
Yep.
I really honestly think, again, back to climate change, that building one-off houses in rural properties is going to be a thing of the past at a certain point in time, because they're not defendable, really, in the same way that a village is defendable or a town is defendable. I suspect that after a certain number of bushfires in each region, we might be consolidating buildings back closer together with no eucalypts around them, and possibly building something like you'd see in southern Spain or northern Africa or the Middle East in terms of absolutely resilient construction.
Yeah. Jamie?
Well, this building had, for its views, $1 million views to the southwest. So the big glass windows are all facing southwest. So solar access came through from the high windows to get some solar access into the building, but yeah, there's a fair bit of loss out of the west, southwest. And then in summer, a lot of solar gain, so which could be corrected with some external louvers or something. But the budget was spent by then. So.
Awesome. Dale, got 1 minute?
I think you're at risk of being inundated by your neighbours wanting to come in. Because I think they're a very good solution or answer to fire-prone areas. But probably the weakest point would be the light court roofs, because they're not earth sheltered or protected. But again, the light courts, if anything dropped down inside the light courts, the wind loading is just not existent because it's gone down a hole, and that's all fire rated now. So yeah, I'm struggling to think of any.
All right. Well, we're going to have to wrap it up. So thank you, everyone, for giving us your time and for contributing to this series. If you'd like to know more, you can view the full case studies at your leisure on the Green Rebuild Toolkit website in the Beyond BAL section. Thanks once again to Alvyn, Jamie, Dale and Nigel for generously sharing your time and expertise. And thank you to everyone who attended tonight for tuning into this session and for your great questions. If you found value in this event series, please do consider supporting what we do at Renew as a member, donating or taking out a subscription to one of our magazines. These are all really meaningful ways that you can support us to enable important change Australia-wide and help us continuing to have great conversations with respected people in the industry across the country. So there's one more session in this series. Please join us next week for our dive into high vegetation risk and bushfire resilient design, when we'll look at 3 more case studies and dive deep into the tricky topic of vegetation and risk to property. Thanks again. Good night.